Yeah, so where go-to-market really comes into play here, and the reason why product and go-to-market have to be in lockstep is that across these multiple stakeholders, it's not just about the product, it's also about how it gets integrated into the workflow. So if you think about it from a customer ops, customer service perspective, that has implications on how you design the end-to-end offering, really. So product isn't just that single patch monitor that goes on patient's chest and that voila, you're done. It's the entire suite of offering that we're offering as a result of it.
Welcome to Concept to Care, where we hear candid stories of success and failure, discuss strategy, and dive into the details that offer advice on what to do and what not to do in health tech.
Whether you're a seasoned pro, growing your career, or just starting out, our aim for this podcast is to be relevant, real world, and tactical. We're dedicated to not only entertaining you all, but also empowering you with actionable insights that can be applied beyond the podcast, one concept at a time.
This is Angela.
And this is Omar.
Welcome to Concept to Care.
In today's episode, we're excited to welcome Richa Gujarati, the Senior Vice President of Product and Go-to-Market Strategy at HeartBeam. HeartBeam is a cardiac technology company that has developed the first and only credit card-sized 3D vector electrocardiogram platform for home use. We'll explore the genesis of Richa's career in product and in go-to-market strategy, tracing her journey through renowned organizations such as Johns Hopkins, St. Jude Medical, iRhythm, and Apple Health. You'll discover the critical role of evidence generation in successfully bringing a healthcare product to market and learn strategies on how to achieve it. Richa will delve into the intersection of product development and go-to-market strategy, offering insights on recognizing when these elements are in sync and how to realign your organization if they are not. She will share her expertise on competing with industry giants and maintaining a competitive edge, as well as tips on selling into health systems. Additionally, Richa will provide her unique perspectives on the evolving role of product management in health tech and advice on becoming a successful product manager in the field. Enjoy the show. Richa Gujarati, welcome to the show. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, guys. Yeah, it's amazing to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited. I think this is the first time we've brought someone on who has the go-to-market experience that you do. So we're really happy to get diving into this. Real quick, before we get into the meat, can you just give us a quick background on yourself and introduce yourself?
Yeah. So I'm a biomedical and electrical engineering by training, actually, who stumbled into product management and go-to-market strategy by pure accident. I just happened to be in roles that were very nebulous, where I could take on activities like product strategy, roadmap development. And these organizations didn't have a product management function. Back when I started in health tech, product management was a function that sometimes existed, sometimes didn't, and definitely wasn't a significant function that it is today with all the buzz surrounding it. So, I graduated from Hopkins, majoring in sort of biodesign innovation and biomedical engineering, co-founded a medical device startup, spinning out of that with an idea that we came across during the biodesign innovation program. It failed spectacularly, but we learned a ton of things about what it takes to build a successful healthcare startup and how difficult it is at the same time. And from there, moved into working at big companies like St. Jude Medical, which is now part of Abbott. It got acquired a long time ago. And Apple, sort of helping drive product strategy, go-to-market efforts. And, the role here from a product standpoint was very much focused on hardware-enabled platforms. So hardware and then some ancillary software and services wrapped around it. In between, I've had a good fortune of sort of helping build healthcare technology from the ground up. So really being able to take products from concept, 0 to 1, helping find product market fit, and then, scaling teams of really wide variety and different type of sizes as well. So it's been an exciting journey so far. And, my passion continues to be really about building solutions that bridge that knowledge gap between consumers and healthcare. Primarily technology solutions that make information that otherwise would only be limited to healthcare setting or limited set of users within the healthcare community. And how do you make that readily available to the average consumer? and what do they do with that information? That's really I want to continue building my career in.
Richa, you have such a rich set of experiences. And, you talked about the biodesign innovation program at Hopkins, where, students are asked to come up with an idea and see that idea through. And you said that you all failed spectacularly, right? And so this was really your first taste of healthcare entrepreneurship. Can you tell us more about that experience? And, I think a lot of times we also need to celebrate failures because they help us to learn. And so wondering if you could share that story.
So Hopkins Biodesign program was what you could say my first exposure to product discovery work. And how do you really do proper product discovery and build a strategy from it, which, as you all know, is sort of at the core of what any PM should be doing. So the way the biodesign program was set up was we had complete access to the Hopkins Med School, and every week was organized by a specialty area. So you would basically go to that specialty, let's orthopedics, have an attending assigned to you, and you would shadow that attending around throughout that entire week, no matter how many hours they were working, no matter what procedure they were doing, no matter who they were interacting with, whether that was a patient or a staff member. And you just observed. You observed and you asked questions. And that really sort of inculcated in us how to build user empathy. How do you do journey mapping work? When you're shadowing someone around for a week and you see them from a third-party perspective doing all sorts of various activities, you really start thinking critically about, well, does that really make sense? Why are they doing it that way? And we did that across multiple specialties. And that's really where we stumbled upon this idea in neurology. So when we were going through the neurology shadowing, one of the neurologists got assigned to us talked about this condition called hydrocephalus. Patients, these are mostly kids, young kids. It's a congenital condition, very easily treatable. It needs an implantable, and that's it. All your symptoms are taken care of. But because that space was very small and was served predominantly by behemoths such as J&J, there had been no innovation in that space for 15 plus years. So for something that was so easy to solve for, the challenge was a lot of revision surgeries. So unfortunately, small kids would keep on having to come back to go through very invasive revision surgeries. And then the technology was so outdated that it just required a lot of frequent follow-ups. And it was frustrating. Patients hated it. Their parents hated it. The physicians absolutely hated it. And we thought, okay, well, we're a bunch of biomedical engineers, electrical engineers. We can do something about it. So we raised a ton of grant money, some external funding as well, and tried building a company in that space from that experience. What happened as we were building that company was we had to do a lot of pig studies in porcine model. That's one of the key requirements for FDA. And those models are very, very expensive. So you can blow through a couple $1 million like that. And the companies that I advise in who are building medical devices or technology solutions where evidence generation is a key requirement, I talk to them about how to get creative with that model, finding a clinical champion who's really vested in your technology, who wants to see it through. They could serve as a great site. And I think this applies to digital health companies or medtech companies alike. Find a clinical champion who's going to carry some of the administrative burden, the cost burden of implementing your solution, because that's how much they care about this technology, that they're willing to do something about it. That could really ease the cost burden associated with evidence generation. And I think in healthcare, you just can't get too far if you're not generating clinical evidence. You have to demonstrate improvement or change in outcomes, whether that's payer, whether that's provider, it doesn't matter. Everyone asks for it. So getting creative and trying to figure out how to do it in a streamlined way is really key.
Mm-hmm.
That's an incredible story. And not many people can say, coming out of a program, they basically were entrepreneurs. I know it's becoming more and more sexy these days to do that, but those were early times.
Not back in 2008.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that's great, and probably lended itself really well to you moving on to your next role after Hopkins. So let's talk about St. Jude Medical for a second. After completing the program at Hopkins in 2010, you joined St. Jude Medical. As you know, most healthcare organizations did not have formal product management, and it probably didn't join as a product manager. Like, that was not your title.
No.
And you told us you rolled up into the clinical org. So talk about that transition from like creating the product function there and, helping determine its scope, and how that was when you were in the clinical org.
Yeah. So, I roll up into the clinical R&D org. And what was interesting when I joined that organization was there were a lot of elements of what we consider to be traditional PM that organization was very much doing. Focus on user centricity. And remember, for St. Jude, the core user was really the physicians, not the patients. Patients were just the beneficiary given the sort of decision-making dynamics at that point. So there was this focus and emphasis on engaging with physicians, broader healthcare community, doing a lot of voice of customer work, or what you may call user needs or PRD development work, running UX research with human factors. So there were these common themes around what you might consider traditional product management. What was missing in that role was assessing how all of that drives long-term business outcomes, which I also think is sort of fundamental to product management, right? And when I realized that that's the gap that I was seeing, so we were doing a lot of this great innovation work, road mapping work, working with engineering and defining solutions. That was all fun. But what did that translate into? How was it moving the needle from a business outcome perspective? So at that point, because PM as an org and function didn't really exist, I reached out to folks in what back then was the product marketing organization and asked them, hey, can I do a little rotation with you? And for them, they were very commercial focused, right? Very traditional product marketing. How do you do sales training, user training, set pricing, revenue forecasting terms? But what was amazing for me was being able to stitch the two worlds together and bring some sort of a holistic perspective in terms of we're just thinking of our product concept and what it will take to bring it live. And now we're starting to connect the dots as far as business outcome is concerned. And honestly, that's the type of experience that really allowed me to shape this perspective on, okay, what does product management really mean in the health tech world? And what should be the core set of responsibilities, sort of stemming off from that.
Tell us a little bit about, taking a product from concept to when it's commercially viable. How do you know when you've done that?
Yeah, it all starts with product strategy from my perspective. Identifying a really, really small sliver of a problem that feels that has an acute pain associated with it. And what do I mean by that? Don't worry about the TAM, particularly in healthcare, right? The TAM just explodes after a while. But find a niche use case where the pain is just so acute and so powerful that there is an imperative for the customer or the user to change behavior. That, to me, is sort of key to really gaining some initial traction and then wide adoption as far as innovating in the healthcare space is concerned. It all starts with that product strategy mindset, right? What is that small problem you're going to find and build a solution that solves for it perfectly.
So you're saying that instead of trying to solve something that has a really large total addressable market, but maybe it's like a pinch, it's not a huge pain point, try to find something that is really, really, really like a sore point where it may be a very small, narrow niche sort of thing, but you're solving it really, really well. And then the market will, you'll make the economics work.
Exactly. It will work itself out because from there, you earn the right to expand into other markets. But if you don't even solve for that, well, I'm sorry, you don't have the right to expand. And the reason why I say that to be particularly true for healthcare as we all work in healthcare and we know behavior change in healthcare is difficult, really difficult. You can have an amazing product, but the pain associated with going through that transition and change is just a nightmare, and it takes forever. But if you solve for a very small problem, but pain is really acute, people have a reason to change the behavior because what they're doing today is just not working for them. You'll hear them complain about it. You'll hear them whine about it all the time. And that's when you know that they have a motivation. There's an inherent incentive for them to change. And from there on, once you get that initial traction, it's much easier to expand into other markets. It's much easier to expand into other use cases because you have gained their trust and credibility. But if you only chase after the largest TAM, where perhaps people are having a hard time articulating the pain point, the barrier to change is that much higher, right? Because the TAM is so big, that means it's deeply ingrained within people's workflow. So it just makes the change all that much more difficult. And as a result, initial adoption all that much more difficult.
And so because you're solving a very large pain point, the solution itself is sticky. And that's how you drive the market penetration.
I think so. Yeah. The solution becomes so sticky because either there's really no alternative. So the alternative in some instances, because the pain is so great, right, might be doing nothing. So again, easier for your product to get adopted and build from there on. Or the alternative is just so hateful. And I'll offer some examples of that. Certain things that we experienced at iRhythm and even at St. Jude Medical. But the alternative can be so terrible that you have no choice but to adopt this new technology because you're like, anything will do. I just don't want to deal with what I'm dealing with today. And that in itself turns inherently sticky. The other aspect of it, I would say, from the perspective of driving adoption, is identifying stakeholders who will be your advocates. So, I'm a big believer in journey mapping. It's kind of a tool that I think sometimes just not used really well in product management, but in healthcare, when you have your product changing so many different hands and have 5 to 10 different stakeholders who might intersect with it at some point, identifying how they might interact with the product. And then what are you solving for them through that feature side or through that productization? And leveraging them to become your advocates can go a long way. So it all starts with identifying a really acute pain point, no matter how big or small the problem, and then solving it so well that people become your fans and they're willing to be your advocates. Healthcare is kind of a funny one where it is interesting that word of mouth advocacy can drive and supersede over a lot of different other types of advocacy or marketing activities. That's why people invest so heavily in the medtech world in KOL advocacy work, because physician to physician, there's that trust factor and they're more likely to adopt that new technology and new solution.
It seems like St. Jude Medical was, that rotation that you self-volunteered yourself for was the genesis or the platform, the foundation for your career. In product and go-to-market, or that intersection of product and go-to-market. So let's switch gears here and talk about that intersection a bit more. You mentioned iRhythm, which is a cardiac monitoring product. And as I understand the story, it's a bit of a David and Goliath story with major incumbents like
Absolutely.
GE and Philips dominating the space. iRhythm was able to go public and stay public. Can you tell us more about that David and Goliath story?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the point that I was making earlier, right? Solving for a very acute pain point, but solving it really, really well. So, when iRhythms came into the picture, they were these at-home cardiac monitors. It sounded like cardiac monitors didn't exist. They existed. But here was the issue with them. They're really uncomfortable for patients to use. So no one wanted to wear them for longer than 24, 48 hours. Physicians hated them because oftentimes the data that came back was just crap because of all the wires, people moving around. So they had to keep on re-prescribing the product. couldn't come to a conclusion about the patient's conditions. The ECG lab techs hated it because all the repeat testing just added to their backlog about having to review the data and help the physician come to a conclusion. And as you can see, across that spectrum, everyone more or less hated the product. And the challenge, though, was existing cardiac monitors, particularly the likes of GE and Philips, were part of a CapEx investment. And it's not like all of a sudden the CFO of that health system would say, yeah, don't use it, use this new monitor, because they have invested so much into it. And as you guys know, most of these sales cycles are 4+ years long. And once they have made that investment, they want to milk it. They want to generate every single ounce of revenue from it. So yes, the pain point felt by patients, physicians, and these ECG techs was really, really acute. It still wasn't enough from the head honchos of a health system perspective to search behavior. So what we did was sort of taking from that playbook, going after a very, very niche problem, was go after patients and position the product for patients who really you couldn't use these monitors for, because 48 hours of monitoring just wasn't enough. You needed to monitor them for longer, and wired monitors just weren't going to cut it. So instead of the physician looking helpless in front of the patient, not being able to offer any answers, you didn't really have an alternative. So you were like, sure, I'll try it, because, it's not like I'm using the existing monitor anyways. And once they try it, they loved it, right? The lab techs started really enjoying the experience because we were putting forward a nice summary report. You didn't have to go through paper trail and backlog of a folder worth of data to review the patient's ECG. You could just see a one-pager summary and say, oh yeah, this can go in front of the physician and make a diagnosis. Physicians loved it because they were getting quality data. Compliance was easier, and patients were happy with the product, found it much comfortable. So compliance was even all that much more easier. So it was a little bit of a trifecta and a flywheel moment for us, where once they started using it for a niche patient population, really difficult patients, you can't give them any answers. They liked it so much that the ECG lab tech administrators started putting pressure to start using it for more and more patients. And before we knew it, we were getting greater and greater adoption, expanding beyond even that initial set of user group or target patient population that we had identified the product for. And that's what I mean. We couldn't have switched that behavior. Had we gone in and say, oh, swap out all your cardiac monitors and only use our product, we would have gotten laughed in our faces and, kicked out. But because we sat with a very concrete problem saying, hey, for these patients, you don't have anything to offer. How about you try this product? See what it's like. And once they got the taste of a seamless experience, good patient experience, good patient feedback, it was much easier for us to expand from there on into another patient population and gain, sort of more across a department level adoption that otherwise I don't think would have happened had we gone in with a very broad scope.
So you start with that strong product strategy. What is the major pain point that you're trying to solve for a small population? And then that way, it sounds like the product and the go-to-market are in lockstep. And the way in is sort of land and expand. You say, just try it. And we're going to solve your problem so well that you can't help but be really sticky and really penetrate and even displace potentially the incumbents.
Exactly. Yeah. So, where go-to-market really comes into play here. And the reason why product and go-to-market have to be in lockstep is, as you can see, across these multiple stakeholders, it's not just about the product. It's also about how it gets integrated into the workflow. So if you think about it from a customer ops, customer service perspective, that has implications on how you design the end-to-end offering, really. So product isn't just that single patch monitor that goes on patient's chest and that voila, you're done. It's that entire suite of offering that we're offering as a result of it. How does a physician prescribe that monitor? Who puts it into the EHR? How does it get put into the EHR? How do they review the results? How does the results end up in EHR? How does billing happen as a result of it? It's that entire end-to-end workflow. And without having that go-to-market lens, if you were just focused on that core product, you wouldn't be solving for all these various touch points, right? You need someone who understands EHR integration. So to make sure that the product gets into the formulary, the results get accepted easily into the EHR system. Back then we didn't have the FHIR standard, and even today it may not matter as much. How do you push for billing? How does this encounter get billed for? And putting, honestly, boots on the ground and implementation specialists, that's what we had to do, because we realized we were disrupting the workflow. We realized we were changing how cardiac monitors were to be utilized and deployed in these facilities. So we had to make sure that, yes, the product is wonderful, but without them being sort of walked through that initial pain of disruption, change in workflow, and then seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, we wouldn't get anywhere with market adoption, wide market adoption and traction. And that's where, understanding the user and understanding all the various stakeholders that play a part in your product adoption is key, but then thinking through it from a complete experience perspective, and go-to-market may very well be part of it, in the sense that you have to now spin up a customer ops function, you have to spin up an EHR integration function, and you have to spin up, some sort of an implementation specialist function, just to drive that wide adoption and stickiness too.
Richa, you were able to move mountains effectively to get these groups to be in lockstep. It's not always designed that way. And I'm wondering if you have advice to, I don't even know, like if an IC product manager or a senior product manager or like a principal could pick this up and run with it, or maybe it has to come from senior leadership. But what advice do you have to kind of drive, like for an organization that's not moving that way? How do you get them to move that way?
So let's talk if you're just an IC, or let's say a group product manager, what can you do within your capacity and purview to drive this change? Ultimately, I think product managers, whether you're an IC, whether you are in leadership role, you have to think about it from, how does what I'm building today drive long-term business outcome? And then work backwards from there, right? To drive that long-term business outcome, what else do I need? Is my product sufficient or not? Collect that evidence and then go socialize it. Talk to your leadership about it. Talk to every other leader of other functions about it. I'm sort of oversimplifying the things we had to do at iRhythm. There was this element of understanding what needed to be done from a customer standpoint, but there was an element of also convincing internal stakeholders. We were a cardiac monitoring technology company. Why would our CIO ever sign up for us to go into EHR integration? That just made no sense. So the amount of buy-in that required, the amount of stakeholder management that required, and convincing leadership at a C-suite level why it was an activity worth investing in was really critical. And had we just thought about it, this is the small product within our purview, and that's what we're going to build and ship, we wouldn't have gotten there. But we had to demonstrate why it was tied to an outcome. And I'll say, when you go in with that mindset, also go in with the mindset that you don't want to ask for an army of team members as part of resources that's required to get the job done. Approach it from an experimentation standpoint. So collect some theoretical data, demonstrate why it's important, get some buy-in, but approach it from a very much an experimentation standpoint, just like you would do, product level experimentation. Hey, we're going to try this out in one account. Let's measure outcomes before and after. See it sticks. And don't hire a ton of resources to do it, right? Get scrappy, take some of the other functions on, get people to play a part into it from other functions. That's where influencing really comes in. But get scrappy, run a pilot, demonstrate outcomes. And then, it's much easier to get buy-in because people see the results. And that's what we had to do. It wasn't overnight that, oh yeah, this is what we're going to do. We basically attacked it institution by institution. First, we said we're going to run only one pilot and let's see what those outcomes look like. We didn't get to hire a single external resource. So for a while, I was playing the sales hat too, convincing CIO at that institution why it made sense for them to invest their resources. And that's okay. Like that's what was required to get the job done and convince C-suite that it was a function worth spinning up and investing in.
So we mentioned earlier that iRhythm was able to go public and that it was able to stay public. And I think that's hard to do in healthcare. I think it's hard to go public before you get acquired. And then once you're public, it's hard to stay public. And so can you talk a little bit about how iRhythm was able to do that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll tell you what my perspective is, why it's hard to go public and stay public. One is, in general, when it comes to retail investors, they're used to seeing quick outcomes. And healthcare by default there's nothing quick about it. Sales cycles are really long. And if you think about it from a sales productivity perspective, I remember this is a metric that some of the investors used to ask us at iRhythm after we went public. What does your sales productivity timeline look like? In other words, how long does it take after recruitment for them to get, perform at peak productivity? In some cases, that's 6 to 9 months. And imagine in an environment where you have to report quarterly earnings, how much patience does someone have where you all of a sudden hire 10 people, 15 people, and it's taking them a year to even show a result. And that's why I think it's really hard for healthcare companies to go public and then ultimately stay public because of this short-term incentive, short-term pressure to show outcomes. I think one of the things that iRhythm did really well is, as I mentioned earlier, really get ingrained into that small use case and then expand. So they were able to paint a really good narrative around what that expansion now looks like. We have adoption for small use cases across all these institutions. Now we're going to expand into them. And you can expand pretty resource efficiently, right? Like you don't have to all of a sudden hire an army of people to expand. So they were able to say somewhat lean. I wouldn't say too lean because we did go on a hiring frenzy because of all the resources available. But we were able to say somewhat lean as we were expanding to sort of satisfy the institution, the retail investors' interest and keep them hooked for the long term at the same time, because we knew that the adoption was just starting. We were starting to see signs of we solved that small problem really well, and now we get to expand into all sorts of use cases, and all of a sudden revenue was starting to honestly explode across certain institutions.
Let's talk about the topology, or like how teams were organized. So, as I understand, you managed product and go-to-market teams under your organization. How were those teams organized, and why were they organized that way?
Yeah, so as I mentioned earlier, for iRhythm, the product, that the patch monitor was just one aspect of it. Everything that came with it from a workflow implementation was also part of the product offering. So initially, within the go-to-market team, we had a team of implementation specialists who were responsible for training personnel within health institutions into how to adopt the technology. There were what you may call sort of patient support system specialists as well, who had to address grievances and concerns from patients, because we wanted to establish a relationship with them and not have them go back to physicians and say, oh, I hate this product or something, this is not going on. We wanted to be readily available and attack them. And then in the near term, even EHR integration implementation specialists were also part of that team, because we had to make sure we had line of sight onto that entire end-to-end offering and how it was being offered to the customers. At some point, when when that entire service got really big, we were able to spin it off.
So Richa, you've clearly, ran product and held a bag. In healthcare, it's not like traditional software as a service sales, right? Like I can't just like Google how to be good at sales, right? In this industry, selling into healthcare buyers is like a concept that eludes a lot of people, and it kind of feels like an industry secret. Can you talk about how successful health tech companies sell into health systems and payers? Maybe break down a playbook for us.
I mean, I will say part of it feels like a trade secret, as maybe a little bit of it is, because it is a heavy relationship based process. And, in order to establish this relationship, like one of the things that I recommend to nascent or early stage startups trying to sell into healthcare systems, let's just talk about healthcare systems for a minute. You have to find champions. You have to find champions that are going to go bat for you. And this is where merging or marrying product management and go-to-market can be really helpful, is you find these champions, you turn them into your product advocates. So they offer perspective, advice as you are actually developing and designing the solution. Now they're part of that process, right? They are very much married to the solution you have developed because they came along with you for that ride. Then it's a little bit of an easier sell because they'll go around, at least within that healthcare institution, talking about your solution. And you have the benefit from a PM and go-to-market strategy perspective that someone from an inside was offering that perspective all along. And that's where a lot of these relationships, quite frankly, get established when they're part of this ride with you. It's really tough, especially when it comes to a healthcare system, to develop a solution and just drop it off the wall. I think that kind of buy-in takes a really, really long time, especially when you are trying to sell into large healthcare institutions, large IDNs. You have to find advocates. You have to find what I call sort of your referral network, so to speak, where, bring them along as a group together and give them material to start advocating on your behalf, not in a marketing or sales way, but in a very educated way. That here's how I use the product, and here's how potentially the product could benefit you. But I just can't emphasize the importance of leveraging them as an advocate for your product, leveraging them as an advisor for product development, and have groups of them. Identify stakeholders that are going to have significant touch points into your offering and into your product, and establish groups of them. So I'll give you an example, kind of going back to iRhythm for a minute again. Have a group of physicians, certain type of cardiologists who are going to leverage your monitor. But then also have a group of what we would call ECG lab techs admin. Now, these are people who run large-scale cardiac monitoring units and services. So have them as part of your product advisory board as well. And once you're ready to commercialize a solution, turn them into your sort of what I call, on the flip side, sort of commercial advisory group, where they go around and evangelize the product, not just within their healthcare system, but at conferences, at academic conferences, and whenever they have their own practitioner meetings, right? There are plenty of those that happen that industry is never invited to. Get them to talk about the product. I think that's where a lot of these relationships stem from. And then those relationships sort of carry through, even if these individuals move from organization to organization. But to me, that's a critical and a core part of how do you effectively sell into healthcare institutions and healthcare systems.
Yeah, it's definitely a hard one. With every net new company, I scratch my head for a little bit on it does feel like a very strong coordination of lots of intimate referrals or warm intros, or I know someone at a specific payer and I can get us a conversation, and all of that truly helps. And maybe that's just part of, being great at sales, but it does feel like we have to work so much harder in healthcare to get your thing across the line than not.
100%. And that's why I'm saying approaching it from an advisory perspective, like, hey, we're developing the solution. Would you like to be part of our advisory group to offer a perspective? Is a little bit of an easier sell because you're not selling them a product yet. You're not asking them to buy anything. You're offering them for advice and perspective. And honestly, what's interesting, this is relevant for startups, is a lot of them are willing to do it for just equity. And it's a really good way to establish those contacts, establish those relationships, and get buy-in when you may not have pre-existing networks. Obviously, it's much easier when you have pre-existing network, but when you don't, approaching it from a let's collaborate on product development is much an easier sell than here's a solution, why don't you buy it?
Makes sense. Let's switch gears here a little bit. Let's talk about kind of traditional product management versus like product marketing or some of the tech startup product management. There are many interesting things about you, but another one of the interesting things about you is that you came from Apple Health. Apple Health builds products from a very mature lens of we've been building products before across a lot of direct-to-consumer verticals. From a product marketing angle, what was it like to work in that environment compared to a more loosely defined, flexible product org like an iRhythm?
Yeah. So what's interesting is, surprisingly, there wasn't a whole lot of difference. The approach to product management, sure, and at iRhythm, you could just do a lot more on your own and never had to get any buy-in. And there was just a lot more freedom and flexibility. But in terms of the fundamentals of how product development was approached, how product strategy was developed, and how go-to-market strategy was developed, there wasn't a lot of difference. And I think had I gone to Google and Facebook, perhaps that experience might have been dramatically different because they have these traditional verticals of product management and then product marketing. But at Apple, those lines are blurred tremendously. And in some way, it's more resembling medtech or health tech than it resembles traditional tech. And there's a strong philosophy behind it that I clearly buy into. And, I agree with. But yeah, the day-to-day of, how do you develop that white space? How do you build a solution into that white space? How do you even identify it? How do you think about product positioning? All of that was very, very similar because, Apple PMs, they're not responsible for working in Jira. They're not expected to be triaging bugs or writing Jira tickets. And there isn't any of that expectation. The expectation is, can you work with the executive team to identify verticals that we want to enter? What does an expansion strategy look like? If you have an existing hardware offering, what customer segment are you going to expand into? With what value proposition? What are the feature sets you're going to build? You build a business case for it, and that's it. Like, you move on. You work with engineering and providing feedback, but it's not a very detailed PM specific task that you otherwise would see at a company like Facebook and perhaps Google.
So the product managers sound very empowered in that sort of environment. And from what I understand, Apple Health, you worked on the Apple Watch. And so what were the biggest problems that you had to solve there? And what obstacles did you have to overcome if you are already in a very empowered product role?
Yeah, where do I begin? It was a really interesting experience in that, as Omar pointed out, Apple's core bread and butter is selling consumer tech products and a wide variety of them, and very successfully. Now come health features, or health solutions that are all that much harder to build, have a longer product development cycle because as I mentioned earlier, the key theme is evidence generation. That's expensive. And then the other challenge was, well, how do you do revenue allocation? How do I know if my 100 Apple Watch didn't sell just because it's an Apple Watch or sold because of this health feature that existed on it. So there was a little bit of a revenue allocation and resource allocation challenge in the sense that healthcare was very early stage with an Apple Watch. But then how do you demonstrate that, like anything else, it had earned the right to keep on growing, get more resources, invest more. And healthcare development requires a ton of investment. So there was that challenge, which I don't think we ever really solved for successfully, honestly. There were ways that it was solved for through narrative building, through doing some buyer surveys, understanding sort of buyer perspective, post-purchasing behavior sentiments, looking at usage, adoption, and all of that. But it wasn't a perfect way, particularly when it came to revenue allocation, and then subsequently, how do you identify and allocate resources accordingly? The second aspect of it was a consumer tech company now trying to enter the healthcare space. And healthcare, we've talked about it extensively, is very closed off, very slow moving, somewhat resistant to change. And here we were building a solution that was going to honestly disrupt how certain things were done, how patients were or users were monitoring their vital signs, how they were going to take that feedback and data set back to physicians. So physicians were very unhappy initially. And in the early days, there was just so much pushback from the healthcare community about that product launching. They were not happy with it. There were all these woes and cry about, it's going to drive droves of people into emergency rooms. It's going to make practicing a nightmare for us. Just a lot of complaints. So the other part of the challenge for us was we're building healthcare products. We had to bring the healthcare community along. We couldn't alienate them. We couldn't make it seem like we were developing things on the sidelines and just forcing them to adopt. We needed to gain their trust, because the last thing we wanted was a user to take their Apple Watch health data to a physician and for the physician to say, I don't want to look at it. It's all junk. That's not something that we could have afforded. And what made that problem even more complex was Apple being Apple, very secretive company. You can't share anything about what you're working on. So how do we bring the healthcare community along? Remember what I was saying earlier? The one way to build advocates is you bring them along during the product development process. We couldn't do that. So there were a lot of what I would say cultural challenges, sort of this tension of building a healthcare product. Healthcare functions a certain way, and then consumer tech and Apple function a certain way. So how do we solve for that? Then there was an incentive issue in the sense that we're happy as long as more consumer tech products are selling, but is it selling because of health features? Is it selling because it's a wonderful tech product? How do we solve for that? And then how do we justify our existence, so to speak? The last piece of it was really changing perceptions around what does product development look like in a very regulated environment, and how do we sort of bring the rest of Apple folks along for the ride as well. And because there was a lot of great talent, and we wanted to take advantage of that, especially as we were building healthcare specific products.
And it seems like Apple was successful in doing that, because for the Apple Watch Series 4 or later, you can actually take an ECG with that watch. And I think that it's FDA approved, right?
It is FDA cleared, and there have been numerous other features after that. As a matter of fact, today an announcement came out where one of the digital endpoints around AFib burden that's collected on Apple Watch can now also serve as a secondary endpoint for all clinical studies, which in itself is a big deal because it's a digital biomarker that's now being accepted as a biomarker. So I don't think all of it has been fully solved for, because cultural changes are just so monumentous, and nothing changes overnight, right? Everything is a slow process. But I do think some of that was solved for. So, for instance, the notion of building the healthcare community along, we figured out a way to do that. We figured out a way to continue to run KOL advisory groups, product advisory boards with physicians, because I think even within Apple, everyone quickly realized that it was important to gain their trust and important to get their perspective as we were developing product for condition management, for preventative health screening products. We needed to get the healthcare perspective, and we couldn't build in isolation. So we were able to solve for some of that. And the seriousness of what we were building and how profound of an impact it could have. Yes, it was slow rolling. Yes, it was going to take a lot of dollar investments and resources. But the level of impact, I think, ultimately sort of convinced the broader organization that this was the right thing to do, and one way to sort of have a lasting impact on a user group.
And I think it's really cool because it really merges or blurs the line between what is health and more in a clinical sense, as well as wellness.
Absolutely. And, this is one of the most exciting aspects of healthcare for me today is this whole consumerization of healthcare in so many different ways, right? People are becoming more and more aware of what their health data means. People are getting very vested in it. Then there's this trend of a lot of wearables just being so readily accessible. You now have your glucose monitor, CGM, that was reserved for type 2 diabetics, readily available. You have your sleep metrics readily available. How long are you in REM? How are you in deep sleep? Very quickly, there's going to be a screening test for sleep apnea, I'm pretty sure. VO2 max, cardiovascular fitness. I mean, all of this information is starting to be made available. The challenge is, how do you package all of it together and really level that up into like true insight and true wisdom to modify people's behavior? But I do think that's one of the most exciting aspects of healthcare today is this broad wave of consumerization of healthcare, people owning their healthcare data, making sense of it, making behavior changes. Because I do think that's going to be the wave that really pushes healthcare overall forward. And, the practice of healthcare probably in the next 5 to 10 years isn't going to be the same because of this.
Yeah, completely agree. And then I think while you were also at Apple, you were able to create new revenue streams through partnerships with payers as well as with pharma. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So, that kind of goes back to the earlier challenge that we talked about, is how do we justify our existence? If it was going to continue to be because of hardware sales, it's going to be really hard to do resource allocation. Watches and phones may just continue selling like hotcakes. So we had to figure out new revenue opportunities, leveraging the health features and health features alone. And one of the hypotheses, particularly in working with payers and life insurance companies, was, can certain health features on Apple Watch help you reduce downstream costs by motivating people to make certain behavior changes? And we actually invested a ton in evidence generation for that. We ran a lot of pilots with a lot of wide variety of payers, some small, some large, that went on for several years under the radar. No one knew about it. No one talked about it. We worked with some national payers and providers, such as the Singaporean government, for instance, as well, in launching a nationwide program around healthy behaviors to demonstrate how it keeps people healthier and out of emergency rooms and, prevention of chronic diseases. And it's through this combination of data. I don't think the job is done yet. But at least slowly, United is now starting to cover for it as a covered member benefit. A lot of life insurance companies are starting to cover for it because they realize the benefit of a product that just fits into your life seamlessly, but can also at the same time motivate you to just lead healthier lives. And this is where preventative care is coming to its head, right? This is where it's actually coming to life. it's not in the biggest sense, the way we would like it to be, the way we would like healthcare to be. But I think that wave is starting. And to me, that's quite exciting. On the flip side, with pharma, as you all know, in clinical trials, particularly, the hardest part is keeping patients in clinical trials and getting them to not continue to collect data you want them to. And some of these trials are several years long. So any and every digital tool that can sort of seamlessly integrate is a value add. And who doesn't like using the Apple iPhone and Apple Watch to do other stuff, right? And now you get to build a couple of health metrics collection apps on top of it that also make it easy for you to collect data. So we did quite a bit of partnership work with them. I don't think we fully figured out a revenue stream through that process. There was a lot of proof of concept work done. But to me, honestly, the payer part is a little more exciting because that's where you can see the healthcare needle moving towards more and more prevention focus.
I love that. I'm wearing an Apple Watch. I wear it every single day. I have an Apple Watch tan line in the summertime. And
Nice.
it is very motivating. Like I got to close my ring. And you're right. It completely is embedded in my daily workflow. So kudos to you. You've had a huge impact on at least my life.
Thank you. No, that's just so gratifying to hear. I'm going to take a little bit of a tangent because this is one of my favorite saying in product. And I'm not sure where this wisdom came around, but one of the things that they would talk about a lot at Apple in particular is how do we know when a product has been successful in driving adoption? One of the metrics is, can you leave home without it? If you go back home to get it, your product has gained successful adoption. And it seems very intuitive, but it is really true is that for the longest time, you could leave your Apple Watch at home and you wouldn't bother going back. But I think that behavior has changed now. You don't just keep it in the drawer and forget it. You might actually go back because you want to, measure your activity and keep track of other things. And to me, I think it's a really nice analogy to keep reminding yourself about anytime you're building a product. Have I built something that requires you to turn back around and drive back home?
Not a tangent at all. Very relevant. And quite frankly, I think it, I will think about that every time my cousin tells me, hey, we need to get up or I need to close my seat ring. I've been sitting down too long. So, which is also like a great segue into just like your viewpoints on product management as a whole and the role itself. I think in our previous discussion prior to the recording, you shared a bit of a hot take. Recent product management content, podcasts, articles have been coming out trying to define product management, get very technical and prescriptive about what product management is. Your perspective is unique in that regard. What are the various types of product management you've seen, and what's your perspective as a whole?
If I were to summarize my viewpoint in one line, it's product management is doing anything and everything to ultimately drive a business outcome for your offering. And that's it, right? It's not defined by a particular function. It's not defined by a particular job type. It's not defined by a workflow lane. It's whatever you need to do to get to that end business state and business outcome. And if it means thinking about go-to-market strategy, then so be it. If it means for a small part, developing customer service training documents and training customer service team members and bringing that up, then so be it. To me, if you're not tying what you are doing to end business outcomes and how you're moving the needle forward for your business unit or offering, then you're falling short in some way or the other. And that's, to me, is the very definition of what it means to be a product manager.
Through all of your experience, you have that hardware component. And so it's more difficult, I think, or has a different set of challenges when you're a hardware PM versus a pure software PM. Can you talk about what skills make the hardware PM successful?
if you're not tired of hearing this until now, but I'll say it again, product strategy. You have to be really, really good at product strategy. And what I mean by that is you have to be really, really good at making trade-offs, making really difficult trade-offs. And it's particularly true for a hardware PM for the following reasons. So feedback cycles when it comes to hardware development are very long. Your mistake, if you make a wrong trade-off, can be very expensive and very costly. Imagine figuring out a feature is either not required or you prioritize a wrong feature once the product is hitting the manufacturing line. Things can get very dicey there. So understanding how to make those trade-offs and really having a strong grasp on what is my real MVP and everything else that's just ancillary is really important. Being really good at thinking through the ramifications of trade-offs is really, really important because you don't get the opportunity for right or wrong reasons to be as iterative as you want to be. Now, there are ways to mitigate it, and technology and all these advancements that have been made in user research testing have made some of these things easier, and they're not as risky of a bet as they would have been. But you just still have to be really, really good at it. I have found that product managers who are just predominantly really good at priority writing and thinking very incrementally, unfortunately, aren't as good at being hardware PMs. It's just a little bit of a struggle if you can't think long term, you can't think 3 to 5 years out, and also don't have a strong understanding of what does a good product strategy look like. This is a little bit of, from my perspective, a little bit of a unique skill set in the sense that a hardware PM also has to think very strategically about buy versus build. So buy versus build question comes up more often when you're building a hardware product rather than a software product, because software is cheap. But as a PM, it's really difficult to get out of the mindset that something is not going to be built internally, right? And just thinking that, we're going to acquire it or we're going to work with the BD team in partnership gets really, really difficult from a PM standpoint. But when you are a hardware PM, realizing how expensive it is to build something, and are you better off acquiring or licensing it out, is that an easier thing to do for your end solution? Becomes all that more important, and thinking very creatively about it. It kind of comes full circle to, what is the role of a PM? When it comes to hardware PM, you have to branch out a little bit too. Sometimes you have to wear the partnership hat because that's what's required to think through the end-to-end offering.
I wish I've given that more thought. I wouldn't have assumed that there were more buy decisions in the hardware PM, but when you say it, it's actually like that seems like obvious. Like, oh my God, yeah, of course there has to be, because there's just so many components to some of these things that you can't recreate. Yeah. And part of scaling is just like figuring out when to actually build something and or replace it or swap it out, and maybe to drive better unit economics or to improve a particular functionality of the hardware. But some companies are really good at producing a specific thing, and they're masterclass in that, and it's like no need to rebuild that. That's an interesting point.
Exactly. I mean, one of the things that we coach early PMs on, particularly when they start working on hardware-centric products, is you write this business charter, so to speak, for your product. You talk about revenue generation. You hypothesize on units, how many you're going to sell, because that's another part of it. But one of the key aspects within the product charter is, should we build this or should we buy it? And if so, what aspects of it should we buy? It really forces you, as you're going into, again, that product strategy and definition phase, what's more important to build internally? What aligns with your internal capabilities better than sort of, just acquiring or licensing something out from outside? It's really important. And the last thing I'll say is, I have a lot to say on hardware PM, but the last thing I would say is, you have to get really good at hardware UX. When it comes to a physical interface, you want to communicate a lot, but you have only so much real estate or ways you can say it, right? If your hardware has to completely rely upon an app to do even the basic jobs, then you kind of fail from a hardware product development standpoint. So you have to think very simplistically from a user interface perspective as well. And you can't just outsource that thinking to a designer. That's just not possible when you are a hardware PM.
You talked about customer centricity earlier, and I just want to double click into that as it relates to the PM role. I encounter a lot of ICPMs that lack this skill, and I think it's mainly because the consumer is often not really the buyer in healthcare, and a lot of healthcare startups are actually like, I got to solve a use case first before I can even start thinking about like the patient or like the customer. So I mean, how do you coach? And it's not even focused on the patient entirely. Like it could be any customers are even buyers as well, right? Like the payers and the providers themselves. So how do you coach PMs to talk to customers? What type of forum, like how often, what are best practices?
Yeah. So part of the answer is dependent on what stage of the company you're in. Are you a startup or a big company? But no matter what use case you're solving for, who you're solving for, right? You have to get really close to all your stakeholders that are going to have a touch point into your product. And if it's patients, then find them. And one of the things that I coach PMs, particularly working in early stage startups with limited resources, or even like early stage founders, is find your users where they tend to aggregate the most, and your world is your oyster. Reddit groups, Facebook groups, especially when you work in healthcare, there are just so many healthcare or condition specific communities out there. Join them, listen to what they're saying. It could be the best signal that you can leverage in terms of understanding that user profile. I've had, I personally have had some success with it where very quickly I put together a survey, joined a Facebook group around patients and individuals dealing with heart conditions. These are 100,000 people that have all experienced a cardiac condition before. Well, why not learn from them? And literally within a day, you can collect so much feedback, push out a survey, get them to provide feedback on certain things. You would be surprised at how willing people are, especially again, if it's a problem worth solving for, and if it's a pain point acutely felt, people are going to come forward and answer those questions for you. So get out there, listen to the signals, find your users where they tend to aggregate the most. There are nurse practitioner communities. Find them. There are administrative communities for certain times. Go to those conferences, run focus groups. If you're not talking to your user groups at a minimum once every month, even if it's a 30-minute discussion, then I think you're sort of developing whatever it is you're developing in isolation. And I push, no matter what level of a PM you are, you could be a chief product officer. You got to be paying attention to those signals. I don't think anyone should be removed from that. As a matter of fact, like this one practice that we used to have at St. Jude that I'm a big fan of is taking forward that tradition from Hopkins by Design program. We would go on these field rides where we would shadow procedures related to our product. We would see how product was being utilized. We would spend an entire week in one healthcare facility, just seeing things, how they were being done end to end. And we brought engineering leaders along. What better way to influence engineering into developing things for you and understanding the pain points versus them seeing it firsthand? I think it's one of the most wonderful practices that St. Jude had. And honestly, I wish every company had those practices more and more. Get in front of your customers, no matter what the medium is.
Richa, you are just a wealth of knowledge. I've learned a ton, so thank you. where we're going to ask you 5 questions. They're meant to be relatively quick and fun. So the first one is, are there any concepts in healthcare that excite you right now?
Yeah, I kind of already talked about it a little bit, but this focus on preventative screening, which is a little bit of a side effect of consumerization of healthcare, right? I think it's very much starting to see with the accessibility challenge somewhat solved for with more and more wearables, continuous monitoring coming into foreplay, where people are really starting to own their own health. They're curious about health-specific metrics, want to take actions, whether it's with a doctor or without a doctor. And to me, I think that's quite exciting because while the rest of healthcare from a practicing perspective still is very much disease-centric, very pathological, consumers are starting to empower themselves and move into the preventive space. And I think as a result, that's going to pull the whole industry towards more prevention focus. And to me, I think that's going to be a really exciting set of years when that actually ultimately happens.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think right now we do sick care rather than healthcare. We wait till the car is broken rather than doing regular maintenance.
Yeah, and people are quite honestly fed up of that, right? That's why they're taking matters in their own hands and saying, yeah, I'm going to track my VO2 max because it matters for my cardiovascular fitness. I'm going to monitor my sleep cycles and not wait until a sleep physician sends me to a sleep lab because I want to take ownership of my own health.
Mm-hmm.
Richa, professionally, which 3 tools can you just not live without?
Yeah, so Miro, as I mentioned earlier, I'm a big fan of journey mapping workflow. So Miro, definitely, I use Monday.com a lot. If anything, I've actually convinced my entire company to adopt Monday.com for task management. We do a little bit of roadmap work there too sometimes, and then engagement with engineering team. And then this might not be a really popular tool, but Dragonboat. So when you manage a portfolio of products, and again, you're monitoring for specific metrics, outcome metrics, Dragonboat is quite helpful as well.
What is Dragonboat exactly?
It's like you can use it for product road mapping. But when you have like product portfolios, so if you have multiple product pipelines or product lines and you want to see set specific OKRs and outcomes related to that, it's pretty good for that monitoring too. And, communicating to exec staff at the highest level, how your overall product portfolio and pipeline is doing.
We will have to check it out.
Yes, that one is new for me. What are some of the most helpful professional or healthcare resources that you found?
Yeah, so there are quite a few, but I would say 2 books that if I can recommend to people. And one is particularly true because of this whole hardware and software angle is Blue Ocean Strategy. I have learned a lot from that book. I think, it's been very effective in my career when I'm building products from 0 to 1. But particularly for anyone building in the hard tech space, Blue Ocean Strategy is definitely a must read. And the other one that I'm a really big fan of is lean startup methodologies. How do you do early prototyping work? How do you get quick feedback? And I know I said it's a little hard for hardware, but because of a lot of the insights coming from lean startup, we've come around to that idea that we can still get early feedback, on product concepts and iterate from there on. So those 2 books would be my favorite to recommend.
I'm honestly surprised by the Blue Ocean Strategy. I joined IBM out of undergrad into their consulting practice, and that was our because you're basically a child still. That was our summer reading assignment, was to read Blue Ocean Strategy. Blue Ocean Strategy.
Yeah, so. It's a very simple book, right? But it's just if you keep on going back to some of the practices mentioned into it, I think that it offers a different lens.
100%. Do you think product management is a science or an art form?
I think it's an art. I am definitely in the camp that it's an art, and I think it's because I don't see product management through a single lane lens through a very set of defined functions. I think it's a little bit nebulous based upon the organization that you're a part of.
And lastly, do you have any shameless plugs?
Yeah. I'm not very active on social media, but one of the things that I am trying to do, because I see that as a little bit of a gap today, is if you are someone building in the hardware and software space, so hardware-enabled platforms or a combination of hardware software platforms, feel free to reach out either via LinkedIn or Twitter. That is a community that I am trying to cultivate and bring about more, because, again, very unique lessons there that I think the entire community can benefit.
Richa, thank you so much for being on the show.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
Hey, thanks so much for listening to the show. If you liked this episode, don't forget to leave us a rating and a review on your podcast app of choice. And make sure to click the follow button so you never miss a new episode. This episode was produced and edited by Marvin Yue with research help from Aditya Treya. We're Angela and Omar, and you've been listening to Concept to Care.